There's a situation you asked us about recently where there's over 120,000 surveillance cameras that have been installed in the United States and have made a very sophisticated network. There's some discussion about whether or not this will happen in Canada as well, and quite a few people actually asked us to talk about this. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about flock cameras. So, what are flock cameras? What the flock is going on? The flock cameras are named flock because of the company Flock Safety that manufactures them. The cameras in particular here are not video cameras by and large, they're photo cameras. And what they do is they take a snapshot of a license plate and the surrounding area around the license plate, but really they're license plate cameras that take a shot whenever a car goes in front of them on the road. John, if you wouldn't mind putting up some images or some pictures of what these flock cameras look like so that people can get some context for the type of pictures that are being taken. When these flock cameras take pictures, they're generally getting about 4 different types of data points. They're getting license plate numbers, they're getting the vehicle, make, model, and color. They're going to get the time and location, so there's a timestamp. So this blue Honda certain model with license plate whatever went on this road in front of the street at 3:25 p.m. on day whatever. And they'll get some detailed features sometimes like bumper stickers, roof racks, and other parts of the vehicle, but it's not consistent. So sometimes it'll be too blurry, sometimes the cameras are an older model, sometimes the weather doesn't really behave. It just kind of depends. But they'll get some of those details sometimes too. These cameras are installed by police departments, homeowners associations, schools, municipalities, a variety of interested parties that would like the streets to be more monitored in the case of criminal activity, speeding drivers, etc., etc. These cameras are not CCTV cameras, and if you've seen CCTV cameras, especially in certain countries around the world, like in England, in the United Kingdom, they're not taking constant video. I want to really make that clear because the issue that's going to come up has more to do with the network that's connecting all these things together and less to do with the cameras taking the image themselves. So with that in mind, these cameras will generally answer the question, who drove past this intersection at 4 o'clock? They're not going to answer the question generally, show me everything that happened between 3 and 5 p.m. So they're not giving you a constant stream, they're giving you a snapshot in time. Let's talk about what this controversy is and what the big problem is. So we're going to go through kind of what the deal, what's going on, what's the deal with this. The issue is not the camera itself being there, although some people have some issues with that. The issue is more so that there's a complex network of all of these cameras being put together where the data can be combined and you can know from the point someone leaves their house to where they get to work, everywhere they went, the exact route, a year of all this travel can be tracked. You can map out with all of these pictures put together an exact pattern of movement and know pretty much wherever anybody goes. When you know exactly where somebody's going all the time and you have that much data, you can derive very personal things about their life, their political affiliations, their exact habits, hobbies, what sort of relationships they have with which people, where they work, what they do for work, how often they work, religious affiliation, all sorts of things. You can find out all sorts of information. And this is where the American Fourth Amendment, and in Canada, our version of this would be Section 8 of the Charter, comes into play. The Fourth Amendment, and you'll hear this brought up a lot when you hear about this issue, specifically, and I'm going to read here to make sure that we're comfortable, that we get the right phrasing for this, is it protects people, or it's about protecting people from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government, and what constitutes a search is a big thing here. It requires warrants to be based on probable cause. and requires these warrants to specifically describe the place and item involved. So when you hear about the specificity part of this, and you look at the probable cause piece, if you have this giant network of cameras and you can just enter a query of show me everywhere this car has been, it's not that specific. And if you can do it before a warrant is required, there's quite a few people that sort of have umbrage with this and argue that the individual camera taking a picture, that could be the same as like a police officer standing on a street and observing your license plate when you speed. But all of these cameras in a complex network where they can track everything you're doing is like the police department dedicating 5 officers to tail you for an entire year every time you drive. And these two things are not exactly the same. So that's kind of the crux of where this comes down. There is some debate on this, and I have a link here that, John, if you could put them to, where the ACLU shows how a fairly recent Supreme Court decision in the United States has commentary on this, on how this may not actually be constitutional, but the law isn't settled. So I don't want to get into the extensive details on the legal side of this because, you know, we're not lawyers here, but this is suffice to say that this is not legally settled, and the way the law interprets this is central to the conversation. Further, this isn't just really a legal question. It's also more of a what the public's interested in ought to be sort of question, because the law is ideally supposed to follow the will of the people. And if the law doesn't match the will of the people, then even if the law is wrong according to the public, there is recourse through political avenues, political avenues, really discussing with your politician, your representative, whoever. But there is something that can be done, even that's non-directly, hire a lawyer to argue your claim in the Supreme Court. There's avenues for that. So if it turns out on either side that this ends up being legal and someone disagrees, or this ends up being illegal and someone disagrees, it's not like they have no recourse. There are still political avenues to eventually change the law if someone thinks that is wrong. Laws change all the time. Now, when you look at the arguments for and against, the general argument against these cameras, and specifically the networks, is that they reveal so much about that person's life and that detail's frankly too intimate to justify without a warrant. The counterpoint that FLoC will often make with that is that people don't really have an expectation of privacy with license plates that are displayed on public roads, and that the system just automates what an officer could generally observe. So they're just doing what the police could do, and really this is just automating the process. And what's wrong with automation? The counter argument to that is often brought up is related to what I said previously. One individual officer cannot really be 2,000 cameras, and the idea is that the original laws were not designed with this level of ease and automation intended. The idea would be that, the original laws weren't ready for this level of technology. That's kind of where this goes on either end. I could get into this further, but it's less interesting. So that's the general idea of what's going on with this. We're now going to get into a different part on something called mosaic theory, and a bit of extra context on this. The reason for this is, before recording this video, I had talked to a few people about their thoughts on this and went over it, and it became apparent to me that even after describing this, it was difficult for them to get the sheer picture of what's going on and what's being argued if they weren't learning about this stuff all the time. To learn more about this, there's three, I suppose, but there's two main terms that come up a lot when you're looking at this sort of issue. The first is what a dragnet search is, and the second is mosaic theory. With mosaic theory, the core principle or core idea here, and you'll see this come up a lot in the way Canadian law interprets the situation. The core idea is that a single camera is technologically similar to the officer on the street, which is what we talked about before, but that the single camera is focused, brief, and difficult to scale. And these three components get actually referenced quite a bit. So that focused, brief, difficult to scale piece, and then the mosaic piece being not this exactly. So when you have 10,000 plus cameras in a network and a database, and the ability to search and infer things based on said database, the idea is that this changes things. So suppose situation one, you have a police officer, they go to a mall and they observe a person at a mall. And they also observe said person maybe at a church one time. So there's one observation of someone at a mall and one observation of someone at a church. And, maybe there's another observation of someone at a doctor's office. Any one of those individual data points on their own doesn't tell you a lot about that person necessarily. It will tell you that maybe they go to that mall fairly often, maybe they wanted to buy something, but it's not going to give you a whole sort of picture of everything that they do. The connection here is the problem. Instead, consider situation two. Said officer has data on every trip to every mall, every doctor visit, all times entering and leaving that you've done for a year. All sorts of things can be patterned out. And the sort of data points that have been argued in mosaic theory, as that they argue that you can get access to with this data. And given what these data points are and what I've seen, I think this is probably true. I have a list here. And John, by all means, put the list beside them so they can get an idea. So I have, all these pictures together in a database instead of one or two. I now can learn the medical conditions and your medical history that you have, your friendships, your romantic relationships, your work schedule, your vacation time and activities. So when you went on vacation and where you went, what religion you practice, how you practice, your political beliefs, the way you choose to exercise your political beliefs, your habits, your daily routine, and some other things. This is more intimate than we saw him over there at 5 o'clock. The argument then being that all this data creates a mosaic of your life. Right, let's talk about Dragnet. A dragnet is a big net that you use to just catch everything. If you've ever seen one of those really big nets from fishing boats where they just kind of grab everything from the fishing boat or from the fish, you have all the, the different fish, the shrimp, the kelp, the whatever, they just get it all. That's a dragnet. In the context of what we're talking about, a dragnet refers to doing a grab everything sort of search. So one example of this is, let's say there is a shooting or there's a violent altercation, a homicide in a mall. And, the homicide's over or what have you, or even not, it wouldn't matter. But let's say there's a homicide in a mall and the police ask Google, hey, can you send us every device ID, or everything that you're willing to send us basically, from every device within 500 meters of this mall. This is a dragnet. The idea being that you're trying to grab everything and refine down further. I'm going to explain out a bit why dragnets are controversial and the issue here, because to many people that might sound reasonable and like, what's the big deal? So normally in a traditional criminal investigation or a traditional investigation, it goes like this. Crime is committed, suspect is identified, warrant is, or some sort of judicial oversight is obtained for probing into that suspect further, and then evidence is collected. So there is an initial refining into the who we're going to investigate before intimate details are gathered. A dragnet system flips this around a bit, and essentially evidence is collected first, and then a crime happens. So first you have the evidence, and then you have the crime. And then after the crime is committed, you figure out your suspect. So case one, crime, suspect, warrant, evidence. Case two, evidence, crime, suspect. And then they would have further warrants and further evidence collected. But the idea being that your intimate evidence is actually obtained before the crime is even committed on everybody, and then basically a search is done. Now, there are different sorts of checks and balances you could argue that you could put in the dragnet system before. However, what will often happen, or what will often be argued, is that the that level of intimate information should not be gathered before there is probable cause in the first place. That's basically the criticism for this. Now, supporters of dragnet systems and this sort of information and this inference will argue that a license plate recording and a searching database doesn't constitute a search. They'll argue that, and that for that reason, these systems do not require probable cause, and that, the dragnet isn't really a workaround for probable cause if it's not required in the first place. The counter argument to this is, of course, the thing mentioned previously, that the database effectively functions as an equivalent to the police tailing every person in the city for an entire year. And that the data that is gleaned from that then is essentially too intimate. So that's the piece on dragnets and mosaic theory. That'll come up a lot. Just I thought you'd want more detail because people will get into that generally. Okay. A quick note on the difference between the Canadian and the American system on this. So just a little side section here. This situation largely is about the American issue with this. You have people destroying the cameras, and you have a lot of this displeasure with the flock cameras, particularly in the States. In Canada, though, just so you understand some of the differences, Section 8 has this concept of a biographical core and really outlines, and this is a difference from the American system, not how the data is obtained, but what the data says about you or what you learn about the person because you found out the data. It's really core to sort of the way that Canada views this problem. It's not that you got my data, it's what that data taught you about me. That's the privacy breach. There are a few Supreme Court cases that touch on this. Please, John, let's put them up on the screen. Of the ones that we put up, there's one in particular that's quite relevant. I don't want to get into the details here, but if you want to look up on it further, by all means, it's a pretty easy internet search. R.V. Spencer, in particular, is quite interesting in that case, and you'll see with any of these cases sort of the way that Canada views privacy. But in that case, the whole idea was that they used one data point and it revealed more about the person from obtaining that data point than that data point really had on its own. And because of how much it revealed, the Supreme Court eventually, after multiple appeals, argued or came down that this was a breach of Section 8, effectively, or this was a breach of privacy. It should have had some sort of judicial oversight because the particular piece of data was it resulted in way too much intimate information being found out about the person. Okay, so now we get to the part that this channel focuses on, a lot of the emergency management or disaster risk reduction, etc. stuff. So let's talk about the resiliency lens here. So when looking through this resiliency lens and applying what we do, in previous videos, we've sort of simplified this into the freedom versus safety dynamic. But for this one, I think that it would be useful to walk you through the broader process and how we eventually sort of refine it to freedom versus safety in this case. That's sort of shorthand to make it easier for everyone to interact with and understand this. But we don't normally call it freedom versus safety. So you want to find out, should you or should you not put one of these policies in place? Should we put flock cameras everywhere and make this network? Is it a good idea or a bad idea? This is the way you would analyze the situation. First, you ask yourself a bunch of questions. And these are sort of categories too, but these are the sorts of things that you would want to think about. And you don't necessarily follow them in this order. You would start on one or the other, depending on what it is and what you're looking at. 1. Is there a cost or a benefit to public safety? So if there is a cost to public safety, then you want to gain something. If there's a benefit, then maybe you're okay losing something. But what is the net cost or benefit to public safety? Does this help or harm people? 2. What is the cost or benefit to individual liberty or privacy? So does this increase or decrease? Does this help make people more free, or does this, take away some certain freedoms type of idea? And freedom is defined differently to different people, but just in general, that's number 2. Number 3, is there an accountability piece? So this is usually government accountability, but it doesn't have to be, because you could have a third party, a private entity that gets involved as well. Is there an accountability piece? How do you handle this? What is the risk of misuse? So, just because you have some accountability piece and you can hold the government accountable doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay. It may just get misused when a new government comes into power. You could have all sorts of other problems. I think later in this, I also mention mission creep, which will come up. That comes up. This is tied to accountability. Equity. So number 4, you have an equity piece. This doesn't normally happen, but it can. So you want to consider it. Sometimes when you put something in place, it helps one group at the expense of another. And when that does occur, you want to kind of think about it. For example, when you evacuate a high-rise building, one public safety policy that's put into place is that people who are wheelchair-bound are evacuated last. The reason for this is because it is better to save more people more likely, and a wheelchair is harder to get down the stairs, so you hold up more people getting evacuated. It becomes a utilitarian argument of save as many as possible. And with that in mind, the person in the wheelchair is sort of being negatively impacted in that they're being prioritized later in the interest of helping the people not in the wheelchair because it's easier to get them out. That's an example of equity. Usually it's not a problem, but it can be, so you want to consider it. You also have cost. So number 5, this is usually, financial, but it could be time, could be money, could be, operating hours. You don't have infinite resources. So, what's your cost here? What do you want to do here versus here? And then finally, the 6th thing, which we talked about quite a bit in the car video on the car spyware, as it were, but does the thing even work? So you have effectiveness. What is the thing technologically ready? Does it even work? And with effectiveness, if that isn't in play, then sometimes you justify maybe more research into the thing, but you're not really going to implement if it's not ready for implementation. When you look at flock cameras specifically, the first thing you want to look at is effectiveness and cost, because you're looking at doing a major installation and making of a system. This is a huge infrastructure project effectively. So is it going to work? Now, on the is it going to work piece, flock cameras are very good at taking pictures of license plates. They are quite effective at that. They are effective. Everyone pretty much agrees that they're effective. They do what they're intended to do. The system itself is very good at sharing data between police agencies. It's optimized for that. It's very good at doing its intended function. As far as cost is concerned, clearly, based on how many of them have been installed, cost is not a major barrier. So cost is not much of a concern for them either. It clearly is going to meet that. Equity is not really a concern because they're just recording everyone, frankly. Maybe someone could make an equity argument, but it doesn't appear to me that there is an immediate one that makes a lot of sense, but there might be one on further reflection. But equity doesn't appear to be much concern. And after that, you really just have public safety benefit, and you have the liberty and accountability pieces. And the liberty and accountability pieces, in this case, can kind of be combined into the concept of freedom, privacy, or, that sort of right, privilege, etc. being infringed. So once you've accounted for the other 3, the remainder can be simplified into a safety versus freedom trade-off or debate. That's kind of the way this is looked at. Now, on freedom, because freedom means different things to different people and can be oversimplified, I've also outlined sort of some different loose definitions or ways people think about freedom. It can mean things like broad categories of constitutional rights, privacy, freedom from government monitoring, autonomy, freedom of movement, and a few other things. In this case, though, actually almost any of them fit. So pretty much any of these work, and they all intersect with this concept. So I found that the idea of freedom versus privacy actually worked really, really well with this one. And the only one that wasn't sort of obvious, because when you look at constitutional rights, it intersects with the Fourth Amendment. You look at privacy, this is about privacy and being recorded. You look at freedom from government monitoring, this is government monitoring. When you look at autonomy and freedom of movement, that wasn't obvious necessarily right away. One thing that can occur with all of these cameras is some people may consider this so unpleasant or such a breach of their privacy that they will alter their movement patterns and they'll feel restricted in movement because they're being recorded all the time. This has an indirect effect on your freedom of movement. So there is actually a freedom-style argument on basically every angle here, which was interesting. Next section, we're going to break down specifically the pros and the cons, the safety versus the freedom debate. So this is basically a list. There's the safety benefits, and then there's the freedom costs, effectively. There weren't really many freedom benefits, and there weren't really many safety costs in this case, to be honest. There is arguably the safety cost of some people are going to want to destroy the cameras, but it's negligible compared to the rest that's in here. I've decided to have an equal number of safety pros, basically, and freedom cons, because I don't want to bias this too much or weigh it in either direction. Yeah, I've seen arguments from regular members of the public that are on both sides of this, and I feel like both sides of this can get particularly charged, and there's readable arguments from both sides. So, okay, let's go through the public safety pros first. 1. The cameras in the network improve crime solving. There's no question that being able to rapidly identify vehicles, track movement patterns, find people more easily, do all this, etc., that clearly is helpful in investigations. That's obvious. If you have a child that has been abducted and you need to track a vehicle, this is an incredible tool or utility compared to not having it at all. No question. One would have to have been not paying attention to not come to that conclusion. 2, it acts as effectively a force multiplier, and this interrelates to the effectiveness of every individual police officer. The reality is that all of these cameras can monitor more of the roadway than any individual officer can, or realistically, the entire police force reasonably could physically. It allows you to reallocate officers from that function to something else. You get to focus on the investigations themselves, more complex crimes, following up on leads, etc. It acts as a force multiplier. You're getting more out of each individual officer. 3, you have crime deterrence. So the reality is that if you're on camera, many people are less inclined to want to commit crimes. If you know you're going to be recorded and you know the police can track you, you're less inclined to try to get away with something because it's harder to get away with. That's number 3. 4, there's actually an officer safety piece here. When there is a stolen vehicle or there is a violent offender registered to a vehicle or whatever, this system allows the officer to pull up data on that vehicle much more quickly because it can get integrated in with the software in their patrol car. So when they walk into a road stop, there is the potential for this system to actually better prepare them for this is about to likely be a violent altercation, or this is not likely about to be a violent altercation. When they know more about the driver they're about to ideally interview automatically, it makes their job less guesswork, and it makes it actually safer for the officer. So there's that piece. And look, things that have officer safety involved, police tend to really like, because police don't tend to like going to funerals for their friends. Let's just be honest there. Number 5, you have more objective evidence. The camera is better than, I swear I saw that person. You have a camera. It's more objective. This is good for innocent people who are being cast with suspicion, and it's better for finding the truly guilty party. The more objective your evidence is, the less police get it wrong on either end, so the less sort of false negatives or false positives you get, type 1 or type 2 errors. That's generally a good thing. Number 6, it is less intrusive in some cases. Consider if the police need to find a vehicle and they don't know where it's gone, they might just send up a perimeter roadblock everywhere and stop all traffic or slow it and have checkpoints. This creates a tool where you don't necessarily have to do police checkpoints, which, while it is recording more people, is less intrusive to the drivers on the road. You're not going to get stopped. They're just going to track that guy. Well, they're going to track you too, but they're just not going to search you, ideally, until you do the bad thing. That's sort of the idea there. And then the final one here that we have listed, the interagency cooperation piece. So let's say that you're in jurisdiction 1 and you do a bad thing. And then you drive really, really fast and you get into jurisdiction 2. Jurisdiction 1 and jurisdiction 2 aren't working together very well. So jurisdiction 1 loses you, and now jurisdiction 2 has to pick you up. With this system, these two jurisdictions coordinate, and when you get to the border, jurisdiction 2 is already on you. This is very relevant when you have certain cases like a child abduction where the person goes to a different state, where they lost track of them because they went out of their camera range. Because all this stuff is integrated, they can have a continuous track and they can find you across jurisdictions. This is a fairly big deal in some cases. Okay, those were the pros. Let's look at the cons. So here's the freedom stuff you're not going to like. You have mass location records. The movements of law-abiding citizens that are not suspected of anything are recorded and saved. So we know where you are, where you're going, what you're doing. We know everything. Even if you didn't do anything wrong yet, we know. Number two, the expanded surveillance, the degree to which you can monitor the entire public is expanded to a scale that was previously basically impossible. The level of surveillance here is significantly more than most people are comfortable with. Now, some people don't really care, but some people find this to be a very serious issue. Number three, there is what's known in social science as a chilling effect. Lawful activities, so let's say that you want to, go to the mall. It's legal, you can, but some people just won't even do these things because they just don't want to be recorded. Some people are very, very squeamish about being recorded, which fair enough. And you might just not do normal things because, I just don't want to be on camera. I don't like, yeah, I can, but I just don't like being recorded. And that has a whole bunch of other consequences that aren't just freedom-based, but that does affect that whole freedom of movement piece I was talking about before. Number four, mission creep. And this is the slippery slope thing number one. And remember, with slippery slope, it's not necessarily just a fallacy, it can be an effect. So this is a slippery slope effect. Once you have this in place, let's say you only use it for murders. How long until you don't just use it for murders, you also use it for simple assaults? And then how long until you don't just use it for simple assaults? Now you're using it for jaywalking. And how long from we're not just using it for jaywalking until we get to the Minority Report and we're doing pre-crime? Like, what is the progression here? What is the mission creep? Once we have this resource, how do we make sure it stays there? Some people are very hesitant about that, and that is a serious freedom con that's brought up. So that's number four. Number five, we have general misuse. So even without mission creep, what if someone who has access to the database just kind of lies or uses it for personal gain, or a politician, which is supposed to have oversight for this, calls a friend and then uses it for their political interest in a bad way, whatever. What availability for misuse does this have? That's, number five. Number six, this is sort of the Pandora's box piece. In government, this tends to be true with power. Once you give government power, it doesn't want to take it back. So once this has been put in place, how do you turn back the clock on that? And it's kind of hard. So, you kind of hit a point of no return. Once people have accepted it, it's just here now, and people aren't sure about what that looks like. So that's six. And then finally, number seven here, the normalization piece, and this is what I refer to as slippery slope 2. Once it's normal and people get used to it, it's similar to the mission creep thing, but it's more on the society side. Once people get used to it, they may be more and more comfortable with progressively greater and greater infringements on their personal freedoms. And if people have heard the, old arguments of, back in my day, we would have never have tolerated this. How are you guys okay with everyone being tracked on their smartphones? What, don't you know you're being recorded all the time? We would have never done this 50 years ago. This is one of those style sort of arguments. Final section. Let's just have a quick discussion here, or talk about sort of my thoughts, a bit more analysis, and where this is going, etc. Fundamentally, this comes down to the public's priorities. This comes down to what you want to do, where your priorities are on safety and freedom and etc., what your thoughts are. With the Sony controversy that we talked about in a previous video, it was by and large the corporate interest versus the consumer. This was really the public either basically didn't care, or if they did care, they were on pretty much the same side. This case is a bit different. This case is the public is actually on both sides of this, and there are arguments from the public's interest on both sides of the debate. Yeah, this one's a bit trickier. Consider family A may have immigrated to the United States, or may have a history in the United States. Immigrated to the United States is probably a more apt example because it's more timely, where they came from a country where they were spied on by the government, and if the government didn't like you, they picked you up off the street, and you and or your children disappeared. That family does not want the government surveilling them because where they just came from was really scary. That makes sense. Different family may have had their child abducted and wants the police to find the person and find their kid. Both of these families are completely valid. Both of these families have a fear or concern related to the safety or of their family. But both of them come down completely differently on this camera thing. So this thing is complicated, and people are not going to disagree, and people, when they view it as a matter of their own personal safety and their families, their children's safety, etc., will be quite stern on either side. So this one is a bit more complicated. Another thing, which I didn't mention previously, but I think is important, related to the whole warrant piece or the government oversight, is exigent circumstances. Police have something called exigent circumstances. So if someone is actively still in danger, if like a child's been abducted, if there's a terrorism threat, if public safety is actively in danger right now, they have this thing called exigent circumstances. They don't need a warrant if they have exigent circumstances. There are a few other exemptions too, but they don't need a warrant. So if, over there is something going on and the public's in danger, they don't have to go ask a judge if they can go fix it. They just go fix it, because if they have to go ask the judge, all those people are dead. So they just go. There is an argument for the implementation of this system where you could make the whole system and the whole network, you could collect all the data, but you could disallow police from hitting the search button until they have a warrant. So you don't have the effective privacy breach where the information is actually put in front of them until the warrant is obtained. Some people will argue that the collection at all is a breach of privacy, and some people will argue that once the information has been put together, it's the breach of privacy. This is some of the difference between the Canadian and the American system here. I would think that the Canadian system would more likely come down on the you could collect it, you just can't search it. In this example, the American might be different. In that system, if you already have the database and they're able to go exigent circumstances, it creates this tool that they didn't have before. And there's a question for the public where if that ends up being the answer to this, if the answer is, we just require a warrant before they can hit the search key, fine. But what do you do about exigent circumstances? And what do you do about the mission creep of exigent circumstances? Because what happens when, in 2026, I have exigent circumstances for this, but then in 2032, how exigent circumstances is defined gets broadened, and now I can do it for all these things. Well, did we intend for you to have this level of data collection before? Are we sure? What about when someone, hits the button and then says exigent circumstances later? Those are legal issues likely going to the Supreme Court. But some people have issue with the police being able to do it at all and don't want to have to defend themselves in front of the Supreme Court every time they have an interaction with a police officer. So there's a lot of moving parts to this. I wanted to mention that one sort of potential resolution to this, because I think that might be one of the main things that is explored going forward. And speaking about America in particular, I think that if this was the United Kingdom, they already have CCTV cameras, they're probably just going to do it. In America, if there's any country in the world that tends to err more on the side of freedom and personal liberty, it would be America. So I would think that, if this were a 50-50 coin flip, not saying it is, but if you were to flip a coin heads or tails, where would America land on? I would assume that America would land on the side of don't put the cameras in more than any other country in the world. That's just something to consider. And I'm not sure where Canada would go with this, but I think that that's where they would want to err, just culturally. They're going to have to figure out how the way this interacts with the Fourth Amendment. Right now, I understand that they're really having a lot of debates with this in the courts, so we'll see where it goes. Hopefully this was informative. And if you read the written piece we'll put up, which is what I'm referencing here, you'll see the words from the thing here. You'll notice the little thing that I drop at the end, which might be a later video, but I feel like if I put that comment up right here, it might be a bit too, it might come off as incendiary, and that's not the point. So I'll leave that little Easter egg for anybody to check out who wants to see it. And other than that, have a good day, and we're watching. We're watching. Yeah, there you go. All right.